Pete Regina is going to be doing a workshop on the physics of holography. It's our last couple workshops. We've had a bunch on 3D technology, the history of 3D. We had some drones flying around connected with cameras so we could see what they see. And Pete's been doing this workshop for quite a while. Really excited to see what he's got to tell us. And we have another workshop coming up in 2 weeks from today at 2 o'clock, an intro to holography course, kind of a little lower down for the young ones. If you have any little ones who want to come out and learn about holography, it'd be a great time. Another free workshop on September 28th. Pete.
All right, thank you everybody. What we've been watching on TV, on the screen here, stop it from getting blind over there, is some of Rudy Burkout's work. Let me just shut this. Okay. All right, so the physics of holography. Thanks for coming. The whole quick review that I'm going to do here are four basic things. Four basic things that are pretty simple in their own right, but they kind of come together in a non-obvious way to really show how holography works and why it works. So if there's any questions, just spit them out. I'll walk through pretty quickly. Once again, Rudy, amazing holographer, did very pioneering work in the areas of color holography and also using holographic elements as objects for holograms. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the setting, but definitely want to credit him and all that stuff. So I'll talk about what's a hologram, what is a hologram, what are we talking about? The four elements I mentioned before, and then I'll talk about some setups and color and various things at the end. And again, if there are any questions, just let me know. So, what is a hologram? So hologram, a physical structure that diffracts light into the shape of an apparent image. Okay, so you can say, hey, that image is the hologram, or you could say that the actual plate with the information is a hologram. You can kind of use it in a number of different ways. But what we're getting at is, how does it work? Why does it work? What is this holography thing? And there's a couple ways of looking at the hologram too. You could say that you could look at an illuminated print and say, all right, this illuminated print is a hologram, and you could also project. I'll show you how you project a hologram at the end in a demo. Right. So I think everybody's here because you've seen a hologram. You're like, that's cool. How does it work, right? Let me just say 3 slides on what is not a hologram. That is not a hologram. All right. Princess Leia, not a hologram. A lot of people think so. Tupac Shakur, not a hologram. Right? But actually, my partner out in California designed this in Digital Domain, implemented it when Tupac did his thing. It's a projector from the top off of a reflective bottom that goes onto a half silvered or a half see-through sort of surface. And Snoop Dogg hung back here. And what you can do, you can get away with a lot of things. If you're more than, say, 10 feet away, the depth of the body starts to become flattened. So the further away you get, and certainly in an audience situation, you can just do all sorts of tricks. And it's called the Pepper's Ghost. Pepper's Ghost has been used in theme parks for ages now. So not a hologram. Also some of these optical illusion sorts of things, these spherical TVs, none of them are holograms. Dennis Gabor invented holography in 1947. He did not get the Nobel Prize until 1971 for that work in holography. And interestingly, the laser was not invented until 1960. So today, when you think about making holograms, it's pretty much the use of lasers. But Dennis Gabor kind of cranked out all this thinking and everything, and even the first couple sample holograms with mercury vapor lamps rather than lasers. So pretty impressive work. And this hologram of Dr. Gabor was taken. Here is the setup, the actual picture of when they were taking that hologram. Steve Benton is another person I wanted to mention. He invented white light. He discovered or came up with a technique for doing white light holography, so the ability to illuminate holograms in white light. Very sad to lose him in 2003. I know a lot of us here were very affected and inspired by Dr. Benton. All right, so the 4 elements that I mentioned before, this is what we're going to just kind of go 1, 2, 3, 4 through. Constructive and destructive interference, laser light, photography developing, and then diffraction. Okay? And you'll see diffraction is going to be kind of maybe the most 1.5 times more difficult than the other stuff, but the other stuff is pretty straightforward. Let's jump right in. Interference. You have 2 waves, they add up. So if you have 2 waves that are in phase here, if you add it up, you just get a wave that's twice as big. If you have 2 waves that are out of phase, when you add them up, they cancel each other out. Let's have a real good demonstration right there. So if you have 2 waves, when they get out of phase, it goes to 0. When they're in phase, they get big. That's it. So just that concept is one of the 4 pillars of why holography works. Now, 2 waves, that's a very simple example, right? Reality is there are tons of waves. I mean, just look at the bay outside, right? You know, you got all those waves cranking in different layers and so on. If we just kind of extend that a little bit and say, let's take 2 waves instead of taking sine waves, and say we have 1 wave starting here, and it generates waves, crests that move out in this direction, and 1 wave next to it. These 2 waves will interfere, and you'll start to get areas of maximum where they constructively interfere, and in the middle, troughs where they destructively interfere. That's kind of how it looks. You know, you have a trough where you got constructive, that should say destructive, I'm sorry, and peaks meet, and you got constructive. If you froze time, just like if you took a picture of waves out on the ocean, that's kind of what you get. Right? So if you have waves happening, constructive and destructive interference happening everywhere, take a snapshot, that's what it looks like. Right? This picture is going to keep coming back in a couple other slides, because it kind of comes to how can we freeze an interference pattern, a constructive or destructive interference pattern. Also wanted to talk a little bit about this. The color change that you see in bubbles is an effect of constructive and destructive interference also, as are the oil spots. What happens is you have light that goes into the medium, whether it's the bubble surface or something like that, and some of it reflects right off the top, off the front surface, some goes and reflects off the back surface of the bubble. And depending on the wavelength, you know, when it pops out, you know, if it pops out exactly in phase, then it's going to get twice as big. So say the blue is going to seem brighter. But red has a longer wavelength, and for the thickness of the bubble, at that point, it's going to cruise out, and you might see 0 red. And the reason you see 0 red is because it's totally destructively taking out the red. All right, so that's kind of, the important thing is, interestingly, if you move 1/4 of the wavelength through a reflected surface, you basically cancel out the effect. That's going to be important, because when I talk about how you set up taking a hologram, none of the path lengths anywhere can move more than 1/4 of the wavelength of the light during the entire exposure time.
And how long is that?
How long the red light is 932 nanometers, so billionths of a meter. So 1/4 of 900 billionths of a meter is what we're talking about. And nothing can move across 45 seconds or something like that. Now, when I was making holograms, a car driving on the street outside was enough to vibrate things. We would shoot from outside because the vibration from our voices would vibrate the mirrors more than that. It's pretty crazy, always doing it 3 at night. Holographers are used to, one of the things that we share is that we've done things late at night in the lab. Okay, that's it. Constructive, destructive interference. One, done. Let's talk about laser light, okay? Because laser light is pretty much how holograms are made because of the properties of the laser light. We only see a portion of the entire spectrum. Actually, when lasers were originally conceived, they were conceived for microwaves. They wanted to have microwave communication very directed, and they created they defined what was a maser. It was many years later that math and that science was adapted to visible light. So light is waves. Okay, each wave has a different wavelength, right? And remember, these waves can interfere with each other. So if we're going to eventually try and record a hologram, recording light, you know, we kind of want to get as much of the things that we can control out of the equation. We can control things very well if we nail one particular wavelength of light. So what a laser allows us to do is get to that point. Here's refraction. You take white light and just kind of splits it up into many. And I actually gave this talk to a high school class. I wanted to see how many people recognize this. About half did. Mercury vapor, I mentioned mercury vapor, what Dennis Gabor used. Each element will give you different wavelengths of light. So mercury vapor, one of the reasons that was used is it has some very strong greens and blues in there that could be isolated through filters and used kind of like a laser. You know, you get rid of all the other wavelengths of light, you're limited to one. You can control that one, you can control the interference, constructive and destructive on that one, and you can actually do something useful. Again, he was doing useful stuff way before the laser was invented, Dr. Gabor. So how does it work? Here's a sample, a demo laser. What you get is you fill up this little tube in here, this little thin area, with the gas, the thing that's going to laze. Sometimes it's a solid state, like a ruby. Was the first laser was actually a ruby. And you throw an electric field around it. That creates all those atoms in there, you know, and all the electrons around those atoms get bumped up to a higher energy state. And they want to come down, so when they come down, they give off a photon. So you get some light out, and then it goes up, down, up, down, up. And you get billions of all of these atoms just cranking out light in every single direction. It's coming out in every single direction, which is why you can see. And so some of these atoms in here that are being excited are sending photons out the side of this tube, and that's what we're seeing. Now there's a certain percentage that's going exactly in line on the axis of the tube. Small percentage, right? And you know, it's a geometric sort of equation, you can figure it out. But those are the ones we're interested in. Because what a laser does is it takes a mirror and it says, hey, if I got one coming exactly down the path, I'm just going to reflect it perfectly back. And on this side, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So you wind up getting light that's bouncing back and forth and back and forth. Now another thing about a laser is the length that it's bouncing back and forth is exactly a multiple of the wavelength of the light. So what you wind up with, and let me go one more slide. What you wind up with is a series of self-reinforcing coherent waves. They're all kind of doing the same thing at the same time. And all the other light is kind of just escaping or just kind of not part of the equation. It's just the light that's going perfectly back and forth that we're interested in. Well, if we have a perfect mirror on one end and throw a slightly imperfect or slightly transparent mirror, so 99.7% reflective, on this end, some of the light eventually, after continuing to constructively interfere, which is always going to constructively interfere because it's a perfect length of tube, you're going to get overflow coming out. And that overflow is the laser light. And it's pretty much parallel coming out. It does diverge a little. There's usually a little lens that's on the front that keeps it parallel. But that's kind of how it works. The beauty of lasers, though, is, okay, let me just go over. We have coherent waves, right? They're all peaks at the same point. They're all valleys at the same point. We have incoherent waves that are all over the place. The phase of those waves are not aligned. And we have incoherent waves with multiple frequencies, so different wavelengths, and they're not aligned. Right? This is really what we want. So, that is inside of a laser. And it's adjusted, you know, and tweaked so that it works perfectly. You get that coherent light, and it essentially continues outside of the laser. So even, you know, it's easy to understand why things might be coherent inside a laser tube, right? So in this little area, right, you know, I get it. It's the right length, you know, things are going to bounce back and forth. But the kind of insight here is that peaks and valleys on all of this light that's coming out are still aligned and still perfectly coherent. And that becomes real important when we get down to how we record that. All right? Lasers can be really big. I did some work, some government work, and this was outside of Albuquerque. This is one of those high-power lasers that can take out a missile at 300 miles. All right, so the key points on a laser, and then we're done with the laser. Single wavelength, coherent beam, and it's a very high power density. So you never want to look in a laser, and the power per width of that beam is very high, which will become relevant when I talk about the next topic. So we just finished two topics: constructive and destructive interference, laser light, single coherent light. Okay, light also is wave-like, and it interferes just like the other stuff does. Let's move on. Halfway done. Okay, photography and film developing. Specifically, I'm going to talk about this to get into kind of what's happening on the film when a hologram gets exposed. Right? In a camera, the object is put through the lens system and is projected onto the film. And that light directly is what is developed. Right? So the image is focused onto the film. Let's take a look at film for a second. It turns out it's a science. You know, to make film. We're really only interested, I'm only going to talk about the emulsion layers. Okay, so all the other stuff that makes film is not really where the science is. So the emulsion has essentially a bunch of atoms and molecules that are sensitive to light, mostly silver halide, and there are some other types, but you know, they're like grains inside this emulsion that is spread out on the plastic or spread out on the glass. And what you're doing is you're shining light into these things, and it's all about how much light you shine in. You shine in light, and the light hits some of these grains, and the grains react to that light, and it says, okay, you know, I am changed because I got hit by some light. And just a half step back, if it's all constructively interfering, it's going to get hit by light. If it's all destructively interfering, there's going to be no light there. Right? So where there is light, those grains get exposed, and then when it gets developed, those grains turn black. Come on. Okay. So a bright light will deliver enough energy to make that happen pretty quickly. And a dim light will take a lot longer to accumulate the energy amount required to make that molecule turn black. All right? So that's kind of just basic kind of the way film photography works. Now let's kind of take the step, what's next after this? If you zoom in, let me go back one more. If you zoom in, that's kind of, I thought this was a cool picture because it kind of shows you really what it looks like in 3D. You know, it's not just this two-dimensional layer. It's kind of a three-dimensional, really thin layer of a bunch of molecules in there. So that's a really microscopic view of color film on the order of this being 5 microns. Now to put that into scale. There we go. All right, so this is color film, so camera film. This is the wavelength of red light right here, down in the lower right. Okay? And if you look at the wavelength of light compared to the grain density of regular film, you realize that, you know, there's a lot of red light that's going to be cruising right through that film and maybe not even get touched, right? And it gets worse because we're really not even interested in the light itself. We're interested in the interference patterns that those lights are making, okay? So you wind up with a situation where there's just not enough. So here's another example. Same red light. If you have a source, a red source that's making a bunch of waves, right? Which is what light is, waves, right? Put it through two little slits. The slits are going to interfere. Okay, we talked about the interference of two slits, right? And you wind up with light that's going to be out here on, say, your film plane, right? Fine, that works. Except if your grains are only this big, you really can't record those fringes because there's just not enough resolution in film, in traditional film. To put it in perspective, really good color film is about 300 lines per millimeter, and holographic film is on the order of 10,000 lines per millimeter. So very small grains, and that's an important aspect. So this is kind of more of a visual on that. So what does that mean? When we take a coherent laser light, a beam, right, that comes out way past the laser, it's all coherent, right? We split that, and you wind up with a pattern that doesn't change. Okay? Because it's a coherent beam, and you're just kind of creating a static interference pattern. Right? What you're doing, though, is you're creating a static interference pattern not from a beam, but whoops, that was the holder, from a volume of light. So it's not like a beam from this guy, right, where we're just looking for an interference pattern. Now you're taking a batch of coherent light and throwing it against another batch of coherent light, and you're creating something that doesn't change because it's all coherent. Now that's important because if you have some of this area right here that is constructively interfering, you got a lot of light. You got twice as much light as elsewhere. And if you have a trough, you have zero light. And those troughs and valleys are on the order of the wavelength of light, so you know, very small increments. Now you can start to think about recording that and actually photographically developing those patterns, right? So a hologram is the information, unlike a photograph, the information is kind of encoded and folded within the interference pattern that you are photographically capturing. That's the difference, and I'll reinforce that and talk a little bit more. Okay, so before I jump into diffraction, constructive and destructive interference. Any questions? Pretty straightforward, right? We've seen it all the time. Laser light, coherent, out past the laser, doesn't move. Right? So when you shine it on an object, light comes off, that's coherent light coming off, that coherent light is not moving. It's meeting other coherent light that's not moving. You're recording that, and you're developing where there was light and where there wasn't light. You get all of these tiny little fringes. Now we're going to talk about diffraction, because those fringes kind of make the light curve and bend.
You showed two holes, and also two splitting. What if you split it like 3, 4, 5, or? I
actually have a slide that talks about that. Okay. You wind up with these funky constructive and destructive patterns. Right? And it's going to be unique to how many slits you have. So it's going to be unique to what you use as an object. Right? And that's the whole non-obvious kind of piece of holography. That interference pattern that you're creating is a unique set of diffraction gratings that allow the light to bend exactly as it bent when the object was there. Let's talk about diffraction. The most important thing to know about diffraction is that it bends light, essentially. If I had a slit this big and I shined a spotlight, I would see a big single shadow on the wall. As my slit gets smaller and smaller and smaller, I'd see a smaller and smaller shadow up to a point. When you start to get down to the dimensions of like light, or wavelengths of light, couple wavelengths or something like that, you start to get wave effects where the light actually comes out, and then you start to get some interference effects. So it starts to kind of come. It's pretty good, and then it starts to act more like a wave. Okay, so I'm sorry, more like a particle. So these are waves, right? It's kind of waves coming through, And then once you go through a small enough slit, it acts like a particle. So it's a single point that's creating a round wave out on the other side. And if you have a couple of those happening, you start to get interference. So we see diffraction all the time. See, no diffraction if it's wide enough, but you start to get diffraction with a small enough thing. Just a couple pictures. Even with a single slit, you start to see some what's called lobes on the side. So you can see, like your light's coming straight here, but you got light coming off at an angle. That's diffraction. Diffraction just bends light. Same like the interference. Here. So we got a couple slits here. And the next slide has more slits. You see that there are numerous angles at which the light goes through. Bends color differently. Here's a good picture. Put a diffraction grating there, your light comes all different angles. So it's all about creating an ability to bend light the same way it was bent when that object was there. When that Tony Bennett was standing there, you want to bend the light through that plane exactly as the light was being bent when he was there. We see it in nature too. This is kind of diffraction. Big waves coming from the ocean, diffractive effects. Diffraction grating, yeah, and you can get pretty far out angle-wise. So, usually after the first couple lobes, it starts to get really dim. But, they're relevant lobes. You're bending light when you got a diffraction grating. Okay, so you record these constructive and destructive interference patterns. You put an object there, and you have a setup, and you're going to get an interference pattern. So, you're going to, let's say, for example, where the lines are, you have constructive interference, and in between you have destructive interference. Right? You're going to get some pattern, some unique pattern for each object that you put in. And then, it's going to be different for every object, but every time you're going to have the analogous static, light and dark pattern that is created from that unique object. All right, so let's review what we talked about. Interference, right? Makes sense. Coherent light makes sense. Right? Film developing, wherever there's light, it kind of makes those crystals black. Wherever there's no light, because of the lack of destructive, you get nothing happening. And at the end, you have diffraction. So these three are involved in making a hologram. The diffraction is what enables it to be viewed on the outside, on the reconstruction side of the equation. All right, let's talk about that. I mentioned that you couldn't have anything vary for more than 1/4 of the wavelength of light, otherwise you're not going to get that static scene, that little, let me go back, that little purple, that little non-moving thing that you want to photographically capture down at micron detail. If you have anything moving, that thing's going to vary, and you're not going to be, your hologram won't work. You'll get a really dim hologram. It's going to not be that good. So you really need to build an isolation table where vibrations from the floor, from everything, just get filtered out. Motorcycle inner tubes, we had a 1,300-pound sand table on cinder blocks, etc. And like I said, even with that, we had to do our work at 3, 4 in the morning because traffic from outside would create enough temporary vibrations that during the 45-second or 2-minute exposure, nothing can move. We would set our hologram up, leave the room so the air currents would die for 15 minutes. Since we're doing it at 3 in the morning, we'd fall asleep a lot of times, right? So you wake up like an hour and a half. Let's go. So then from outside the room, you have it wired so that you could trigger your little shutter without vibrating the table. So we had our shutter hanging from the ceiling. So it was isolated from the table and so on. So that's the sort of stuff you need to do. No vibrations during the exposure time. The more powerful laser you got, the shorter your exposure time. Just like the more light you have, you can get away with a shorter shutter speed on your camera. It's the exact analogy. So if you're trying to shoot 8x10s with a little laser, you got to take that light and kind of expand it very wide to reflect off of something and then illuminate an 8x10. You're killing your light power. So you might have to go for like minutes. can't have any vibration. If you have a path length that changes by a quarter wavelength of light, you will see this bullseye pattern close in on itself one. So for every time it closes in or opens up, you can see, and we used to have these bullseye patterns beautifully, like right on the wall, and you touch the table. And this was a 4x7 piece of 1-inch slate, and we would just, as light as we could touch the table, and you'd see this thing going all over the place. It was actually pretty cool. Remember this, okay, I'm not going to review it, but this is why you need that stability. All right, so let's talk about a holographic setup. We have some coherent light that comes out of the laser. You split it. Part of it becomes what's called the reference beam. It's just a beautiful patch of light that goes directly onto the hologram. So a nice patch of filtered light. You're going to filter this to make it beautiful, right? But this would be like a reference beam. The object beam would be something, you would take your beam split, or you would take one of your beams and you would light an object. So you light an object here. Right? And some of that light would reflect off the object and go onto the film, and the other light would go directly onto that film. What you get and what you're creating there is one of these. And what you're going to do with that is develop it. And this thing is going to be unique to that object. Everyone with me so far? Right. There's a way that you can set up these things where you can have your one laser beam coming out, right? And where's the reference beam is going straight onto the holographic plate. Right? So you split off some of the light, and then go through a lens, expand it, and this is your reference beam. So you got just light going directly onto the plate. And then your other beam, the one that goes through the beam splitter, you're going to split it again, and now you can light your object from both sides. Right? And some of that light will come off the object from both sides and hit there, and you'll get a time static ability to capture that light interference pattern on the plate. So when we get to playback, what we're doing is we're removing this object now, and we're sending the beam in, the reference beam, at the exact same angle as we recorded it. And then we're going to induce the pattern. In essence, we're inducing the pattern that was there when the object was there. We're inducing that same pattern, because really you're taking whatever pattern you created, and you're inducing that pattern to let the light diffract in the same way as when that unique object was there. You've captured in time the interference pattern that bent the light exactly the way that object was at that time, and everything was static, and you recorded it. And the diffraction and the magnitudes and scales allow that light to bend exactly as it did when you were recording it. So you're inducing the bending of the light through the pattern that you've captured photographically because you had your right setup. Everyone, I see a couple of heads nodding. That's good.
You say it has to be exact so that you get a perfect wavelength, but there's human beings in the hologram, and they naturally move.
They will absolutely move. I'll talk about that in a couple seconds. Okay? Right now I'll talk about it. So, how do you get these human beings, because you're not going to be able to have them sit still for 45 seconds. In fact, the first time I ever saw a really good holographic exhibit, there was one pulse portrait of Boy George. And Boy George had these 3 or 4 dark fringes on his cheek. And I'm like, what was that from? I didn't get it at first, right? It didn't click in. And after about 30 seconds, I'm like, holy cow. So what a pulsed portrait does is you take, okay, let me step back. In order to record something on film, you have to have enough light to get those silver molecules to turn black, right? So that you can have a light in the dark black fringes, right? And if you have a dim amount of light, it takes a long time to get enough energy into those silver halide molecules. If you have a lot of light, a powerful laser, it'll take a lot shorter time. Well, if you have a very powerful laser, like a laser that can send out thousands, like megawatts, right? You could pretty much cut down your time to microseconds. So a normal film speed would be 1/30th of a second or 1,000th of a second. We're talking down into the some number of millionths of seconds, right? Because you have so much power that instantly all of those silver molecules are saying, okay, I had enough, man. I'll be able to turn black when you hit me with developer, right? And what you do is you capture all of the motion in that a couple microseconds, and you're done. And your image doesn't move. Now, what happened with Boy George's thing? During that couple microseconds, that pulse laser was actually putting light into this setup, right? His cheek moved. And each fringe, each circle, represented the movement of one wavelength of light. So that's called holographic interferometry. You can actually use that to do stress testing. A good example is you take a can and you make a hologram of the can, and then you put a little rubber band around the can. You can't see it, but if you look at it holographically interfering, you can definitely see exactly how many wavelengths of light each part of that can has moved. So you can really do some science with holography as well. So that's how you do it. You just use super powerful laser, you pulse it, and you're basically doing everything instead of in 45 seconds or a minute, you're doing it in microseconds. And hopefully you have a good setup and nothing will have moved. And it works. We did a hologram one time of a rose, and I used a little silk rose to set up all our light ratios. The ratio of light from the reference beam to the object beam you want to kind of work with. There's optimal ways of getting good results if your reference beam and object beam are of certain ratios. But so I used a silk rose to do all of the light measurements and blah, blah, blah. Then we cut the real rose, put it in a shot glass, left the room, let it settle for 15 minutes, did a 45-second exposure. This is going to work beautifully, right? Started developing it, and right away, as soon as it hit the developer, we're like, man, that's not what we think it should look like. But you can't tell until your whole hologram is fixed and then dried, which takes 45 minutes or an hour. And you don't want to accelerate the drying by doing a hair dryer because it kind of messes with the emulsion. So you got to wait. You're like, damn, I thought that was going to come out. Turns out that our petals had all these black lines on it. Like, man, what the hell happened? And we didn't realize during the 45 seconds, when you cut a rose, the rose starts to open. And we could tell how many wavelengths of light, how many billionths of a meter, the tip of that petal moved during that 45 seconds. Turned out to be, and the other stuff was super bright. So it was a really good hologram, but it wasn't what we expected, but it was almost cooler than what we expected. So anyway, that's kind of how that works. Final thing I want to do, and then I'll show you one or two examples that are pretty cool demonstrations. There's two ways to light a hologram. One is, and I'm going to turn this light off for this. One way is called transmission, and one way is reflection. This here. So I have a transmission hologram here of a swan. And, so the light goes through the object. Okay, can you see that swan? Does everyone see the swan? Yes?
Yes.
So the light goes through, it's transmitted, actually this way is better. It's transmitted through the hologram, and the hologram is bending that light so that it was at the exact same angle as when this was taken. Right? So transmission hologram. All the other holograms around, and that's an example of a transmission hologram. Kuo's green hologram over there. Because the light is transmitting through the hologram. There are some real nice color transmissions right here in the back. The other type is reflection holograms, where, as you might imagine, the light reflects off the front. Okay, it's same sort of thing, except in this way, it's reflecting and bending. And this is the white light viewable that Steve Benton initially described and kind of got a patent for it and then put it in the public domain. So reflection and transmission. One other demo that I love doing because it's a really cool demo. Each point on this hologram has all the information from the object, from that swan. So, you know, the swan is back here, right? So every point on this hologram has all the information of that swan from that perspective, or that perspective, or that perspective, or that perspective to the swan. And a great way to demo with that is by doing this. It's going to be the wrong. Let's see, a second. Hold on a second. Bear with me. I'll get this to work. This thing is on. I need. Okay. Can you see the swan on the wall up here?
Yeah.
If I match the.
Ghosty.
Let me try that. Okay, you see that swan over there? Right there?
Yes, yes.
Now watch, if I move the beam left and right on the hologram, you see the way the swan moves? Okay? Because that swan on the wall is being lit only from the dot on the hologram. And you can see if I turn it away from the angle that the reference beam was at, it gets dim, and it maxes if I match the angle of the reference beam. So even up and down, you can see the swan go up and down a little bit, and left and right, because every spot kind of has all the 2D information of what was on that hologram. And then it just kind of all integrates together when you have your eyes and you do this, and you get a smooth connection of all of those 2D images. Just like you would expect, you know, if you have a million images. It's the way this TV works. This TV has 8 or 9 different angles that you can look at, and you know, so that's why you can see some depth. Your left and your right eye are seeing different things. So constructive and destructive interference, laser light, photography developing, and diffraction on the playback. Pulsed lasers for the pulsed holograms for shorts. Color. We didn't talk about color. How do we get color? I mean, you see beautiful colors on a lot of these things. Turns out that if you vary the thickness of the emulsion, the light will change wavelength. And you got to watch, you know, because you know you're making these. When you develop the hologram, you're developing the interference band. So you're going to get black lines where there was light, right? And then white, and then clear lines where there was no light. Right? One of the techniques to make the hologram brighter is to take all those black lines and make them clear. So you bleach it. So you basically pull out all the blackness, all the silver ions, all the ones that were only the ones that turn black, and you basically make it clear, and you get a much brighter hologram. But what happens is your emulsion shrinks a little bit, so you get a little bit shift of color, possibly, and you know, you get some noise introduced from pulling out those things, you know, so it's not as perfect as it might have been otherwise. So you know, it's really an art form in how you get the process down of doing the developing. That's how far we got. We got to the point where our next major, and we were making beautiful 8x10s, you know, not something we were going to go. We never did it for money. But our next thing was we would have had to get so much better control of the temperatures of the developers and all that stuff that we just didn't have time to invest and get to that next level. But you know, guys like Sam and a lot of others are there and this sort of stuff. All right, any questions? Did it make sense?
Yeah.
Is there? So I've done this a few times now, and did it flow properly? I mean, it kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Now you know how a hologram works.
Yeah. I have one question.
Yes.
How come there's, see that's like green, purple, and yellow, but can that just be black and white?
So that image near the front is kind of black and white. There are types of holograms called achromatic holograms,
Yeah.
and a lot of that early work was done at MIT Media Lab under Steve Benton. And they actually did it very purposefully, where the red, green, and blue, you use 3 lasers and get 3 interference patterns, and the 3 lasers would be at slightly different angles, which would correspond to the the different angles that the light would naturally diffract through the grating, so that they all diffract in the same direction, create a white image or a slightly. You can control it by how you handle the geometry of your set. So a lot, I would, that one looks like it was done.
It still has a blue light on it.
Has a blue light on it.
It's a blue laser?
I don't know. No, it doesn't have to be. I mean, it's just like, if I lit this swan, and we shot this swan with a red laser, right?
Yeah.
And if you light it up, you can see it's perfect size, and perfect ratio of the actual swan, right? If I were to make this beam parallel, right? Because when we shot the swan, we collimated the reference beam, because you get a little wider field of view if you use a collimated beam instead of a widening beam, like those sorts of things. But if I were to use a green laser to light that, you'd still see the swan. It would be a little smaller because the wavelengths are different, and the effect is you're going to have different bending, so it's going to have an effect on the apparent size of what you got going on there.
So we're talking about everything here is analog plates. Why can't we move to the next stage, which is digital plates, like in regular photography?
Say the question one more time.
So today you talked about analog plates, like we used to do in photography.
Right, like that. Yeah.
But today everyone's using digital. So are there any attempts to create digital?
So that's a good question. So you got a piece of film, which is an analog medium. What's being done to bring that to digital?
It's trying to capture what recognizes.
Yeah, it's stereo.
And then you can play games with it.